did Jesus claim to be God? I want to talk about a series that I'm going to do because I'm going to do some kind of follow-up videos on this question. I was already working on this, and then I saw that Alex O'Connor had on Brant Petrie, who is kind of the most recent scholar to argue that it's plausible that the historical Jesus did claim to be God, or I should say divine probably is a better word. So I want to use this video to kind of introduce how we approach this question and some of the problems I have with it. And I think it all stems from a virtually impossible question in biblical studies. And this is the impossible question of biblical studies. The impossible question is, to what extent is Jesus invented by the Gospels? And to what extent did they faithfully present who the historical Jesus claimed to be, what he said, that sort of thing? So people like Petrie, or another example is Richard Bauckham. So Richard Bauckham argues that the Gospels could be eyewitnesses. But the thing that people don't really realize is that all you ever do with those arguments is not to argue that Jesus did say that. What Bauckham does is create a way to read it as plausible that the Gospels could be eyewitnesses. So that's all that you really can do. And that's virtually kind of how you have to approach any kind of historical question within this gap, within this space between the portrayal of Jesus in the Gospels and the question of a historical Jesus. There's an impossible circle there. And all you can ever do is try to figure out which is more plausible. Is it more plausible that the historical Jesus looked, said, did the things that are reported in the Gospels? Or is it more plausible that the historical Jesus was invented by Gospel writers? And I'm going to do some videos coming up on each. I'll take each Gospel on its own, talking about the different Christology in the Gospels, and I'll talk about Paul too. I want to talk about this gap of plausibility, talk about how we assess this, and talk about why I am still with the consensus of like 200 years of biblical scholarship that Jesus probably didn't claim to be God. And here's kind of what we have. On the one hand, so here's one side of this question, and I just told you there's a binary in this question. One side of this question, did the Gospels make Jesus up? So let's ask some logical questions. Do we have other Greco-Roman literature making up fancy, exceptional, extra human almost characters? Yes, all the time. We have a ton of evidence of this. Do they add things like magical birth narratives to explain why these, figures are so exceptional? Yes. I wouldn't say all the time, but we do see them. The Alexander Romance is a great example of a kind of exceptional birth narrative. Heroes often have sort of divine human type birth narratives. So yes, we do have this. Do we have Greco-Roman literature that report the deaths and resurrections? Or I don't think resurrections is quite the right word, but like report people being vindicated, being seen alive after their deaths? Yes. I interviewed Richard C. Miller. You can read his book or watch that interview. I'll put it here. And he documents, I think, hundreds of cases of this kind of thing, of people dying and being seen alive after their death. Apollonius of Tyana is a great example of somebody very similar to Jesus who dies and is seen alive after his death. But Miller has documented a ton of cases, which includes like the Caesars, which is one that we talked about. So yes, this is a common trope in Greco-Roman literature, that exceptional people could be vindicated and seen alive after their death. Do they report exceptional people being divinized or elevated, in some kind of divine or supernatural status after death? Yes, that's what a lot of Miller's work shows, that kind of goes hand in hand with that. What about like internal to the Gospels? When we look at the Gospels, do the Gospels report on things Jesus said and did within his lifetime? Are they relatively recent? No, they're at least 40 years. Most scholars agree that the Gospels were written after the fall of the temple, or maybe Mark, maybe a little before if you're being really generous, but most of them after, and it couldn't be well after. We don't know. So at least 40 years after the life of Jesus. Were the Gospels written in the language Jesus spoke? No. We have, by all accounts, even in the Gospels, which again is our only source, but Jesus spoke Aramaic, and our Gospels are written in Greek. So you already have a language barrier there, even if you want to say that these are the words of the historical Jesus. Do we have any indication that those Gospel writers actually spoke the language of the historical Jesus? Tougher question. It is really tough. We don't really know. You could make the argument for each of them, but we don't really know for sure. It's plausible that some of them may have spoken it or read, or at the very least had some limited knowledge of that language. Okay, this is ongoing. I can't touch this in this video because it's a huge scholarly question. So that is the evidence that the Gospels may have made up a lot of the features of the historical Jesus, that they may have made up Jesus' claims that are never really even explicitly that divine other than the Gospel of John, but that's the evidence the Gospels could have made this stuff up. Okay, let's look at the other side, okay? Is it plausible that the historical Jesus said or claimed to be divine? Is it plausible that the historical Jesus made those claims? Now, I'm not saying the historical Jesus didn't claim to be a Messiah. I actually think that's possible, and I think James Tabor makes some interesting cases for it, and I'm hoping to have him on pretty soon to talk about it. I think that's plausible. Possible. Is it possible Jesus used words like the Son of Man to describe himself? It's possible, but we're actually talking about divine here. Like, is it possible that the historical Jesus claimed to be divine? Do we have any evidence for any Jewish character ever, especially around this time period, claiming to be divine? No, we have none. We have no evidence of any Jewish character claiming to be divine. Did the earliest Christian movement within Judea and Galilee, within Palestine at this time, did the earliest Christian movement think that Jesus was divine? Actually, no. We have evidence from later church fathers. Eusebius and Epiphanius both write about a group that they consider heretics. These were the Ebionites, and they were the followers of Jesus within Palestine. So literally the place Jesus lived, his followers there were considered heretics. Why? Because, well, not the only reason, but because they didn't consider Jesus to be divine. So his followers in the place he lived were dismissed by later Christians for not considering Jesus divine. And if this was like something that Jesus claimed that somehow bypassed not his enemies, but somehow bypassed the earliest Christian movement and got out to the Greco-Roman world, that I find that really difficult to believe. It seems more likely to me that his followers in that geographical space, that probably actually some of may have been converted by him to his movement, it seems more plausible that they would have a better understanding of what he actually taught. This is a different subject, but I've been thinking about this since I interviewed James McGrath. He does a lot of work on a modern movement that has their roots in antiquity called the Mandaeans, who follow John the Baptist. And there are, some issues with their texts and their traditions too, and he talks about these in his work, but he argues that there is a historical kernel that kind of goes back to the historical John and some things about Jesus too. Did those traditions report that the historical Jesus claimed to be God? No. And you take him with a grain of salt, but as far as we know, no. That was just Jesus kind of was a follower of John, according to them, who went off the rails. Do the Gospels ever make it explicit that Jesus claimed to be God? I'm going to do a thing on each Gospel. I can't do justice in this video. I don't think any of the Gospels think that Jesus is a human strictly. I think that John, with the highest Christology, does present Jesus as divine. I think that's pretty clear with his Logos Christology. But when you come to the Synoptics, which people think is a accurate reporting of things the historical Jesus said and did, I don't really think that, but some people do. You have to read between the lines to see Jesus as divine. Jesus does exceptional things. Jesus claims exceptional things, but you really have to read between the lines to see divinity, and that's what people often do when they make this argument. Does John's high Christology make Jesus claim to be God? Yes, I think that's likely, or at least divine. And I'm going to do in the video on John, I'll talk about the Logos and what that actually is in relation to like Hotheos, like the God. But nevertheless, the question you have to ask, is it plausible that John's high Christology comes from the lips of the historical Jesus? I find it very difficult to see, because if that's true, the historical Jesus has to have some kind of understanding of Logos philosophy, of Stoic or Platonic kind of Aristotelian Logos philosophy that is present in the work of Philo of Alexandria. So there certainly are Jews who know this at this time, and Philo is kind of a contemporary to Jesus. Philo may have traveled to Jerusalem. Maybe you get some of these ideas in Jerusalem as well, this like Greek philosophical movement, using Greek philosophy in the category of the Logos to explain how God interacts with the world. This is what John pulls from. John pulls from this movement. So John is within kind of the realm of Jewish philosophy in his day, but does it make sense that a Galilean peasant who has, fishermen and tradespeople as his followers, who is probably baptized, follows John the Baptist, if we believe all those things, does it make sense that that same person can be using advanced Greek philosophy to describe himself? I find that unlikely. I find that really difficult to believe. So I'm going to do more work on each of these in further videos, but as you look at this gap, as you look at the gap of plausibility between whether the historical Jesus claimed to be divine and whether the gospel writers made up that Jesus claimed to be divine or that Jesus was divine, the overwhelming evidence from antiquity, all of the evidence we can pull from is on the side that it's more likely that the Gospels were, if not fabricating the historical Jesus, which I don't think they were completely fabricating, but it's more likely that the Gospels made up a lot of this material, because we have all of the evidence that happened. We have none of the evidence that Jesus ever claimed to be divine from the earliest Christian movement in Galilee and Judea, from any Jewish character ever claiming to be divine. This is just all stuff that we are missing. And I think the burden of proof, and the reason biblical scholarship for so long has said that Jesus probably never claimed to be divine, is for these reasons, and then some, which I'll talk about in subsequent videos. But the burden of proof is really on the people who are saying that it's plausible that the historical Jesus claimed to be divine. And they still have the same sources we have. Like, they can do all the work, but all they can do at the end of the day is mine the sources and go deeper and deeper and try to figure out, doubling down on the sources and interweaving them with, the Gospels, with like the Hebrew Bible and stuff like that, and trying to make the case that Jesus claimed to be divine. But in my opinion, when you look at this impossible question as to whether the Gospels make up the claim that Jesus or invent Jesus claiming to be divine, or whether the historical Jesus actually claimed to be divine, it's much more plausible to me that the Gospels made it up than that the historical Jesus claimed it. I'm going to cover this more in subsequent videos, but for now, we'll stop there. That's just kind of an introduction to some of the way that I'm thinking about this, and I think it really goes to show you, hopefully, why a lot of biblical scholars come down on the sides that the Gospels don't accurately report exactly what the historical Jesus said and did about his own status of divinity. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.